Will mean for a bit of a raggedy start for some, but they'll catch up. So welcome. Because of my need to end on time, I'd like to start on time. And I know that's hard because people tend to trickle in on Sunday morning, but that's okay. As you're coming in, there is a handout. It's really more of a bibliography than anything, so it's not as if you necessarily need it for the time that we're going through, unless you want to have a place to take some notes or jot a question or two. My intention for our time today is to spend some time sharing some things and then have some time for question and answer and observations at the end. And then Jane Dickey will kind of continue just a few extra minutes after I need to depart to keep letting you share some observations with each other, because I'm sure that you'll have things to share. Well, I will introduce myself. I said to Judy I didn't want to have a formal introduction so we could just dive in, but I am, of course, one of your pastors, Jill Russell, and I am here for this week and next week to share with you some of the sabbatical work that I did this past summer and early fall. And in many ways, it's just sharing with you some of why I wanted to look at this, some of what I learned before and during sabbatical, and it's very much what I'm continuing to learn. I often put before myself more than I can manage in the time allotted. This was no difference. I didn't get through everything on that bibliography, so I'll be continuing to learn about this even as I invite you to do the same. So I'm going to just go ahead and begin. Let's see here. It helps to turn it on and point the right direction. When I went on sabbatical the first time, and let me begin by saying what a gift it is that you give your pastors sabbaticals. Thank you for that. I had my first sabbatical when I came here in 2015, and I came back and led a 4-week session called Reconciliation as a Way of Life. And the image that's in the middle here was on that slide when I taught what was about 5 or 6 years ago now. And I have it back because I love this image. It's a Celtic image. I have an example of it that I got on the island of Iona that will hang in my bedroom again when I finish unpacking from our move a year and a half ago. I haven't got not much on the walls yet. And I love this image, and I've come to love it as an example, a pictorial example of the biblical idea of shalom. That's not what the Celtics had in mind necessarily with this image, but it's one that I've come to enjoy. And I realize that the biblical idea of peace is continuing to be a part of what drove me to this topic. And so I just noticed the 4 words: God, self, natural world, and others. This was the definition I shared last time about what biblical shalom is. It comes from the reading of Hebrew scripture, particularly the stories from Genesis, but beyond that as well, to recognize that we were created to have a relational and interconnected nature for us as creatures and as created world, that the divine and human relationship was meant to be characterized by fellowship and deep trust. Think back to that Genesis story. The relationships between humans was to be characterized by a sense of mutuality and a shared vocation. This is all, again, thinking of that Genesis story. And then that the interior life of human beings is to be marked by freedom and wholeness. Now, how many of you feel like the world we live in, or your world you live in, is like this? Any takers? Any hands in the air? Somewhat? Sometimes? Yeah, you're being funny back there. So here's some additional biblical exhortations, I would say, from the New Testament that I think speak into the topic that I chose for my sabbatical. So from Matthew 6, Jesus is saying, do not worry about tomorrow. I love the wisdom. Tomorrow has enough of its own worries, right? That's the paraphrase. So don't borrow trouble. Philippians tells us, do not worry about anything, but by everything, bring everything in prayer and thanksgiving to God. Matthew 8, Jesus is with the disciples after the big storm and says to them, why are you afraid, O you of little faith? And then Ephesians 4, be angry. I appreciate that our writers understood that anger has its place. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. So if you think about worry, if you think about anxiety, if you think about anger, how those speak to that biblical image of shalom, those relationships with yourself, with those around you, with God. Again, anyone want to claim that this characterizes your day, day in, day out? Not many of us. So the Bible gives us a beautiful image of how it is that we are made to live, what the quality of our life should be like, who we should be in relationship with, who God is. I have found that I've needed to dig beyond just Scripture to understand the how of all that's here. How to handle the worries that come forward, how to deal with the anxiety that comes up, what to do with anger when it comes forward. And that's a part of what I think makes for resilience. If you think about the idea of people being resilient, no matter what comes in their lives, whether suffering enters their life, whether a pandemic or other forms of disruption come into life, whether you've experienced a trauma. Resilience, I think, in many ways describes being able to move through those things without getting stuck in any of those things, right? And so these are things that happen. Jesus wouldn't teach about it. The writers wouldn't talk about it if it wasn't a human experience, worry, anxiety, anger. But the idea is, how do we move through them? So when I was teaching last time about why I chose for my first sabbatical the topic of reconciliation as a way of life, I shared with you where those passions came from and where the questions came from. And this time I think I would say I'm sharing with you more of where the struggle has come from, more so than passion, and where the questions came from. My sense of it, this is what I shared last time, is that very often the things we get really interested in are autobiographical, whether we know it or not. So I'm going to share with you, I'm going to speed run through the autobiography here. But you may recall, those of you who know me, about my childhood, that I have a brother who's 5 years older, came to us when he was 5, very emotionally disturbed, spent a good portion of his adult life in prison, and continues to have quite a lot of challenges. So that's a part of my formation. We also had 9 foster kids in my household as a child. In adolescence, I was the friend who was the counselor, which meant I heard everybody else's stuff too, in addition to my own. College, I studied psychology, wanting to understand, I think, all of that stuff. Seminary, my initial instinct was to do a combination degree of MDiv, MSW to try to continue to be able to utilize some counseling skills. But a internship in a parish pointed me in a different direction. So I went into the parish, and in my first pastorate, I was ordained at 24, and I think about that congregation with a lot of love and I don't know what the word is, but those poor souls, to have a 24-year-old pastor, right? Solo pastor. And I was doing what 20-somethings do, beginning to look at my family of origin, how some of those things impacted me. I was dealing with a pretty significant depression that I hid from my congregation. I was able to function quite well. None of them really knew, but any moment I was home, I was in bed and not able to function very well. When I never mess around with mental health, so I had a therapist, got some medication. But the thing that really helped me move through that depression, and really haven't struggled with it until recently again, was finding someone in my community that did something called rebirthing. And I could talk to you all day about that, we're not gonna. But what it is a form of breath work that's combined with, my best words for people to understand it is like spiritual direction and meditation and breath work. And it really is something that she and others who do this work were intuitively understanding that neuroscience is helping us understand better today. And it was so incredibly impactful in my life that I trained as a rebirther. And for 10 years after I left that church, or however many years it was, I always worked 3/4 time as an interim pastor and had a private practice in rebirthing. And I did that until I came here. And then more recently, what brought this topic to the foreground was some personal things in our family and pastoral experiences. Now, I've shared pretty much all of the things on this list. with the congregation at different points. I'm not going to go through it in any length, but this is the last 5 years of my family. I'm just going to read some of the key words. Andrew had a concussion that brought forward some mental health struggles for him. Anything I speak of about my family, they've given me permission to say. That's not the same thing as giving you permission to go talk to them about it. Do you hear what I'm saying? I mean, Andrew would probably talk to you about it, but please do not approach Cassidy about anything that she's given me permission to say. You may recall that I ended up, I'm smiling only because it was awful. It wasn't funny. But you may recall that I was involved in finding out that one of the pastors in our area was a sexual predator and walking with his victims over that summer. That affected me more than I knew at the time. I had my own cancer scare, which led to a hysterectomy. After that, anxiety kicked on for me. If I was ever having to choose, if you ever go to therapy, they're going to say, do you want to be depressed or anxious? Because they got to put something down. It was always depressed for me before. It became anxious afterwards. I wasn't even nervous about it. I don't even know what happens, but something happened in my body that anxiety kicked on after that surgery. Then we had an armed intruder in our home while we were there that next summer. Noticed my daughter starting to show signs of depression. As she went into middle school, she was in therapy for a year before she felt safe enough to tell us that she had endured a trauma in kindergarten that she had not talked about to anyone for 6 years. COVID came. We all know what that did to all of us. Online school revealed that that same child, who's always been a straight A student, was ADHD off the chart. We didn't know. It's part of what she was dealing with. And then other issues for both kids. My parents, my mom's had Alzheimer's since 2017. My dad started showing dementia, and I had to immediately, kind of from a crisis point, take over all finances, medical things for family, recognized that they were going to need a lot more care as the years came. Summer of 2020, my own mental health was really strained at that point and ended up needing to take a mental health leave, which I am so grateful to you all for providing. I believe that Gordon was the one who flagged for me that it had come to that level, which I'm very grateful for. We got on the phone with Jane, and I was on leave within about 7 or 8 days. So I appreciate that kind of responsiveness at this place. Then 2021 is when we realized can't care for my parents even though they're 1 mile away at the level they needed. So this was the real estate year, sold 2 houses, bought another, renovated it so we could live together. Then you all know about the flood and then the fact that my dad died in the fall. So these are all the things in my life that made me want to understand better resilience because this was a lot. Here's what was going on pastorally. In the years, and these years go back probably 10, working on racial justice work and looking particularly as a white person trying to understand better these dynamics, I noticed reactivity inside myself and in others when we talk about that topic. I also noticed in my own work an increase in pastoral counseling with congregants, both from the community and here. Lots more depression and anxiety that people were describing, whether they were diagnosed or not yet. Lots of family conflict that really seemed to come during COVID and some of the political divisiveness. Boy, that really went down the middle of some families. And in COVID, some very different issues. For some of the more active retired folk, they were bored, lonely, looking for meaning. From some of the younger generations, complete overwhelm and stress from the disruption of work and school. These are all the things that led to the sabbatical proposal that you've all seen, and I'm not going to go through here. So I'm going to start sharing with you some of the resources. Some of these are from before sabbatical. You might have noticed that language of speed running, that I felt like over that time period I was learning a lot because, as I say, I don't mess around when it comes to well-being, so everybody was getting to doctors and therapists and all the things in our household looking at how we could be more resilient in the face of what we were dealing with. But it was while pastoring and parenting, you know, all the things, and it was like boom, boom, boom. I had these resources, but I was kind of taking them in on the fly and wanting some space for integration. So these are some resources that all of this is on that handout that were very helpful in some of the pre-sabbatical time when I was trying to understand more. Dr. Joy DeGroot, how many remember when she was the LEDA keynote speaker a few years ago? She introduced to me some very particular research around how trauma and PTSD was helping her to work in the African American community. And she wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, which is really interesting to look at the particularity of how slavery impacted over the generations trauma. Dr. Nicole LaPera wrote a book, How to Do the Work, and that was recommended to me by Cassidy's therapist, and I noticed it was on my own therapist's shelf as well. If you pick it up, it's pretty pop psychology kind of style. It's like self-help sounding. Because she wanted to share her work with people who don't have background, but it's based on some really good foundational work, and two of the clinicians in town I trust the most recommended it, so I dove into that book. And it got me interested more in understanding how trauma impacts the body. She talks in her book about physical symptoms that are very common for people who've endured trauma, and funny enough, my child had every single one of them: migraine, GI issues, chronic fatigue, joint pain. This is common for people because of the way that stress impacts our nervous systems and our bodies. And then also began teaching me a little bit more about the nervous system, which we'll get into in a minute. My own therapist is a big proponent of the work of Kristin Neff, who does self-compassion. And some of you who've come to see me, and you know about this, because I recommend this to everyone. And I'm going to ask right now for Ken to open up the website for a second. Dr. Neff has done a lot of research. On her website, go to the research tab, and you can see how either she or her colleagues have explored how the self-compassion practices impact just about every field you could imagine. And you'll see all the articles about that. But where I go all the time is to the practices. And next week, when we're getting into some of the more practical things that I'm going to share with you, we're going to listen to, it's a little lower than you can see, it's a 5-minute meditation with her that'll give you a feeling for what the work of self-compassion is looking to do. I've said this about restorative circle work. I've said it about nonviolent communication. You can grasp hold of the concept in about 5 to 20 minutes. I'm making that up. Maybe you need an hour. I don't know. But it's not hard. When we look at this next week, it's not hard. What's really, really difficult is to be able to use it when you need it. And part of what I found with self-compassion, which is a form of trying to calm your nervous system and pay attention to what your body is telling you, is that I had to practice it while not under stress for a very long time, which nobody feels motivated to do, right, in order for it to be useful when I am under stress. So I'm going to introduce you to a 5-minute one of hers that you can get a feel for the work, what it's about, and you can go ahead and go back to the slides. But that's been a really helpful piece. And I didn't ask permission for this, but I'm just going to say it. So I've tried to tell my kids about this stuff, and you can imagine how they are in their preteen and teen, like rolling of the eyes and whatever and all of that. But I am noticing after many years of planting seeds, they're beginning to use it now every once in a while and can see the value. So I do put that out there for you as well. Finally, Dr. Sean Neighbors. He is my hero. He is the owner and operator of the Anxiety Treatment Center in Kalamazoo. Cassidy's therapist talked to me after 2 years and said, I love hanging out with your daughter, but that's what we're doing, is hanging out. Because she was unable to do the somatic therapy work for trauma because her anxiety was so high. Said, so I'd rather hang with her over at the Oodle, where her therapist was on the board and stuff like that, and get her to the right therapist, which was Dr. Sean Neighbors. And it took a long time for Cassidy to want to do that, but when she did, she's now a year and a half in. He works only with people whose anxiety is moderate to high and have failed. I'm just kidding about failed, but kind of flunked out of another therapy program, meaning he really wants to work with people who have very high need. And a year and a half in, making a huge difference. And I've learned a ton, and I screwed up in her early years about that, and that's just, it is what it is in terms of the things we learn as parents in terms of how to be with anxiety. One of the things that he teaches is that Anxiety is something that all humans have. We all know this. But the best way to deal with anxiety is to learn how to be less distressed by it. The impulse to get out of situations that make us anxious, to avoid them, which is what was happening in our household, and COVID made that real easy too, that is actually going to increase the problem with anxiety over time. So one of the things that I loved about meeting him, we only met him in person one time, but we went down and he showed Cassie him being interviewed on the news. It was during COVID. They wanted to talk mental health. And he said, see if you can see when I'm having a panic attack while I'm being interviewed. He was having a panic attack while being interviewed, and you can't really tell, because he learned how to not get distressed by those things that happen in the body and to be able to keep going anyway. So that's a pretty high bar, but he was proof that that is possible. So this is some of the resources before sabbatical. Here's the resources during. The biggest was an online course called Healing Trauma Program. It's a 9-month class. You're designed to kind of check in and be with the people in the course once a month, and then stuff you did in between. I went to it in January, saw the 1,200 other people on the course with me, very big course, and quickly recognized I couldn't do this work while pastoring, so I saved it all for my sabbatical. And if life was what I wanted it to be, maybe I would have gotten through the whole course. As it is, I'm about halfway through. And I'm going to keep going, so I'm looking forward to learning that. But those are the names of teachers. I particularly love Deb Dana, who is one of the people who has brought the research around the nervous system and the polyvagal theory into clinical realm, and a lot of clinicians have learned it from her. Resmond Menachem is a therapist who specializes in trauma. He's an African-American man. He makes connections to the work of racial justice, and we're going to look at that with him next week. Brilliant. Loved him. Then our own Jane Dickey put me onto this book, which I've been using as a parallel kind of companion, Cognitive Processing for Therapy for PTSD. This is for therapists. I'm not doing therapy as a pastor, but it's really interesting to see the research and how it connects to some of what I'm learning, and I've really enjoyed it. And the last resource that has been central to my work has been internal family systems, which I know our friend in the back, Ms. Ann McKnight, knows about, and is actually going to bring a little bit of this into our restorative circle training at the end of the week, so I look forward to that. But I'll be talking more about this one next week. Then there's the list on the page of all the other books, that some of which I read, some of which I haven't gotten to, and they're all there for you. So let's dive into some of the key insights. So this is really one of the most helpful things that I found during this time, was coming to understand that what is called the window of tolerance, which is described as kind of that optimal place where our energy and nervous system are in a calm place, relatively. It's not about not having some highs and lows, but where you're able to engage with people around you well, the social engagement system's operating well, you're able to notice what people in front of you are showing you from both their words and their bodies. You're able to tune into that. You're able to express yourself in your conversations with people. This is shalom. Yeah, that's my thinking. This is our best selves in that place of peace when we're here. When certain kinds of things come up that are upsetting to us, whether those are big or small, many of us just shoot up in our energy. You know what that feeling's like when you get activated a little bit, something someone said you don't agree with, or certainly if you've gotten in a car accident, you're going to be up in that energy. It's some measure of dysregulation. These are all the words they use, hyperarousal, dysregulation. But here's the symptoms: feeling overwhelmed, rigid in your body, maybe in your thinking, tension in your body. This is where people who end up being here for a long time, when they're constantly up in this state, will start to use substances, whether those be food or alcohol or drugs or sex or whatever. Addictions form. And I remember Tom Mullins teaching us about addiction and saying the reason people go after those substances is that they work so well. They help mitigate the discomfort of being up in that hyperarousal kind of space. This is where you might see rage expressed, overeating or restricted eating. People go both directions, and irritability. Am I going the right direction? Yeah. So then down below, when you're below that, is when your energy is really bottomed out, when you might crash, if you will, when you feel like you don't want to do anything, where you're just like really, really low. Symptoms here are a reduced awareness of sensation, physical sensation. People who get into this space don't notice their bodily sensations very much. They become emotionally numbed, kind of flat affect, if you've ever seen somebody in that space. Very difficult to think and process. Become, if you've ever heard that idea of dissociation, when somebody feels like they're up above their body watching something happen to them, they're in this kind of space. Lethargic, sleepy, spacey. So, the window of tolerance, there's movement of energy, right? When we're in that space, you're feeling highs and you're feeling lows, but it's moving kind of like this throughout your day. What it can look like for someone who is dysregulated a lot is like this. They're moving just kind of up into lots of elevated feeling, and then they crash, and they go back up, and they crash. Then they might be up there for a while and crash and be down there for a while. Do you see the only time they're in the window of tolerance is as they're quickly moving through it to either being hyper or hypo aroused. And you know, we came to understand in our family that there are some members of our family who function like that. To get to school and work, they're all the way up there and come home and crash. And so we've been kind of working together, each of us in our own ways, to protect the privacy of those involved and figuring out how to be able to be in the window of tolerance more. What you'll find with people who are regularly like that is that the window of tolerance is pretty small. And so that they're constantly on one side or the other. So those are all defensive states. If you look at them, I'm going to actually slide past this for a second to go here. This is talking in more detail about the vagal nerve that regulates a lot of this. I'm sure you've heard people talk about it or seen it. It comes out of the brain, goes down, and it has these networks that go through to every system of the body. And the dorsal, which is down lower, when you're kind of like flat out, is the most primitive part of the brain. Coming up into the more mammalian brain is when we get up high into the sympathetic stuff of fight or flight. And then the ventral is this front part of the body where the window of tolerance kind of thing shows. So I'm going to show you a picture next. This is where you kind of overlay those. I'm going quick through this, but notice some of the language. I'm going to put, let's see, where did I put it? I know I put it on there somewhere. Did I end up deleting that slide? I sure did, because I had to. So imagine this saying fight and flight on either side, fight or flight, that's up here. And this is freeze. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, that sometimes under stress people freeze. And then some of you might be familiar with the tend and befriend, which is another way to handle when trauma or stress or disruption comes, that you learn how to tend yourself and befriend other people. And self-compassion is a practice that helps you to do that. But those are, if you've ever heard those phrases, fight, flight, freeze, friend. Those are kind of the way they get talked about. That's how it lays against all of this, research about how the nervous system works. So why is this important? Because your health depends on it. Look at the benefits of having, that ventral state, that being in the window of tolerance. Reduced inflammation in the body, a control over your immune response, lower risk of stroke and heart attack and diabetes. Obviously, emotional regulation, right, that you're able to not be flying off the handle all the time. You have an increased capacity for friendship and connection. I mean, does this describe what we all want in life? That you have resilience and compassion. And when those things are not functioning in their optimal ways, then you start to see all kinds of physical issues relating to inflammation in the body, immune dysfunction, digestive problems, respiratory problems, chronic fatigue, depression, anxiety, social isolation, and loneliness. So when people ask sometimes about why would you, as a Christian pastor, want to be engaged in understanding this and being able to share this, because for me, it's a part of the how to live into some of the biblical visions that we are given. You could sit and hear me preach every single Sunday, do not worry, do not worry. Give your things to God. Don't be anxious about anything, but by prayer. You know, I could just, and you aren't going to be able to do it if you've lived through a pandemic, which everyone in this room has now done. If you have any manner of the things that, I described in our household, you've all had your own. I know that. It's really difficult to do. So part of what I was learning for myself and for others was how to give some support to the efforts of being able to live out some of the biblical vision that we've been given. So I just went through this really fast. I'm going to go back to one slide I skipped, and then I just want to have some conversation with you about it. I think there's a lot more I can share through conversation than through presentation. But this was really helpful to me when one of the main teachers in healing trauma talked about when we're up or down, when we're not in that window of tolerance, that those are defensive states. We're actually designed to go there. And you know why they're helpful. If a tiger jumps out at you, being able to run or being able to fight is crucial to your survival. You know why being able to play dead is crucial to your survival in certain situations. Those are states that were given to us as gifts to use when you need them. What happens, of course, is we get stuck in them, and it's the stuckness that really is the problem. It's very helpful to realize that when we're in those states, our thinking is driven by those states. So think with me for a moment. Pull into your mind. I really want you to pull into your mind an experience of this. A time when all of a sudden you got triggered and got angry. Can you just, I'm sure everybody's had it. So think about that for a moment. Bring that forward for just a minute in your memory. Now imagine that you're there and you stay there for the next 20 minutes, that you stay angry for 20 minutes. Part of what will happen is that your thoughts that you think are just rational descriptors of what's happening are being fueled by the biochemistry in your body of that anger. And so we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. We all just had a shared experience of an annual meeting, and I had some people reflecting on that meeting over the last week. And it's fascinating to me how a couple different moments, things that were shared, got reported back to me in really different ways. Same room, same presentation, what was heard was very different. The meaning people made of it was very different. And it had to do with all that backdrop of how what they heard connected to who they are, what matters to them most, kind of how they feel about that topic. All of that comes into the foreground for me and for you all the time. So that's really helpful. It doesn't mean that we then can invalidate what people are saying to us because we're going, oh, you're in a defensive state. You're angry right now. I don't have to listen to anything you say. No, but it will allow me to be a little more curious about, all right, there's a lot of energy coming at me right now. I might want to put a little protector up for myself so that I can be curious with them about where is that passion coming from? And be curious about that. Ask them if they're willing, if they trust me enough to tell me a little bit about that. Can we hear that? Because there's probably something really important I'm not getting right now because all I feel is the heat when there's actually something really important behind the heat. This is what I was trying to write about in the email this last week, that we need to have on the table together to really sort this through. And similarly, to be able to acknowledge when my own stuff is doing the same. So this is just Jeffrey Reinstein just talking about the fact that you're going to have angry supporting thoughts. You're going to have anger supporting memories that come to mind. You're going to really think a lot about how unfair this was, how wrong they were. Now think about yourself when you came down from that state and you think back on it. Very often we have a different we have more available to us. Let's put it that way. We have more memories available to us, more capacity to hear what they were saying that becomes available when we're not in the state. And then finally, Peter Levine's comment that trauma is not so much the things that happen, but whether or not we have support in releasing those things, moving through those things, and this is crucial, an empathetic witness who walks with us. That can be a family member, a neighbor, a pastor, a therapist, but is there someone who is able to kind of hold space for that person to talk through, move through what happened to them, with someone offering support along the side. I remember when I was doing some research in college for a paper about child abuse, that was a key piece for how kids did and didn't have resilience. Did they have someone in their life who could say what happened to you is wrong, and this is what your life should be like, even if they couldn't change anything? Just having someone hold out that life could be better and different made all the difference in the world for those children. So this is some of that same idea. So now, what are the things that you are thinking about? What are you observing? What are you asking of yourself as you hear this? Next week when we gather, I'm going to share a lot more in terms of the practical resources to help you, to help me, us be able to move through some of those activation periods into a little bit more of that sort of shalom space, ventral space. So what are you guys thinking about? Go ahead.
I'm Dan. Thank you, Jill. This is really very stimulating on so many different levels. I too have been blessed in the past with sabbaticals, and I know lots of colleagues who have had sabbaticals. And I sense that there's a fair amount of pressure publicly in the questions that come to the sabbatical recipient after the sabbatical to portray it as how was it? It was wonderful. That's the pressure to portray it as everything you had hoped.
Yeah, sure.
What I appreciate so much about a piece of it, one of the things I appreciate so much about what you're saying is that you're talking a lot about what you have learned, but it's very much a dynamic learning.
Yeah.
That
Sure.
it's going forward, and you alluded to or used the term, I think you alluded to the concept of practicing, which of course as a musician, I find that very meaningful.
Yeah.
So that may be a lot of reaction, just not with any question.
Sure.
But maybe you want to talk a bit more about that dynamic learning that isn't so much, the sabbatical was wonderful, the end.
Right.
But more, what is the practicing that you are trying to do? You've alluded to it.
Yeah, appreciate
Thanks.
that. One of the commitments I made to myself and to the personnel committee was that I wasn't going to bring this incredible pressure to get through the material I had laid out for myself. The first sabbatical I recognized, this could have been a doctoral project and a DMin project. You know what I mean? Like just laid out this enormous course of study for myself. And that first time I did push really hard to try to get through as much of it as I could. And I knew that this time around, that wasn't going to serve me or the church. I needed to come back refreshed. And refreshment doesn't always mean reading all the time for me. The practicing is crucial. I think I said with self-compassion, I think I was making myself do those meditations with this woman whose voice bugs me. I hate to say it, but I hate her voice. Doing this meditation with her for a year at least. And I don't mean every day, but it was in my repertoire of evening meditation, a couple times a week or whatever, for a year before I was able to use it when Andrew made me mad. I'm just, for example, so practice is essential for this. to be able to use it in a moment. Now, I had been using it for a while after the fact of kind of moving from ventral up into some kind of, higher state of dysregulation. I could then come back in and do the meditation and sort it out and come back down. That, it had probably 6 months in when that was starting to happen. But to literally use it in the moment took about a year. So those kinds of practices are really crucial for being able to use this. I will also say this, I wanted to integrate what I was learning, both with all the things I've learned before and with what was happening in people's lives that I was encountering in pastoral care here and myself. And that meant moving slower. I would go through, you could probably go through hearing the lecture, I know how long it was. I could see on the screen. It was 57 minutes. And there was about 6 of those per module. But then there were these practice pieces, and they really encouraged you not to move on till you got that. And so I stayed on module 2 for, hate to tell you how many weeks I was on module 2 to work through whatever that material was. So that is part of the and then just, weeks when I was like, I'm exhausted, I can't do any of this. And then there was that. So, it was kind of this interplay. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jill. This is Cindy. There's a lot there. I was like, hey, can we just breathe for a minute?
I know.
There are really a ton. And for the phrase secondary sufferer came to my mind, which is Jim Cook's kind of line. And I think all the stuff you listed about what you'd been through and just how some of us connected with that in different ways and just how the ripple effects, I think, carry out through the congregation and the community. And then it becomes not so much about you, which is great. I mean, we can focus a lot on you, but I think it just sets off a lot of stuff for everybody. And then I'll give you this other stupid little picture that came to mind was, remember the days of the Care Bears where they had that heart?
Yeah.
And I remember Jaakko Hamann talking about making space in your heart, as you talked about being alongside folks in trauma. And that has been such a helpful framework for me from when Jaakko described that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a way to just kind of put it in very real terms about making space. And sorry, this isn't just about you. It's about
go for it.
A lot of people where we encounter something very different.
Yeah.
But can we just kind of imagine, is there a bigger space here? Yeah. And then finally, thank you for making that connection between the biblical injunctions, don't worry, don't be afraid, and getting real with it. That I really appreciate that. Thank you.
We still have copies of, I think we have 10 or 12 left, of these beautiful little books. I'm so glad you mentioned this, that Gene Cook we put together after Gene Cook. So some of you don't know these names. I know you're new to Hope Church, but Jim Cook was a longtime professor at the seminary. His wife, Jean Cook, was a powerful person in and of herself in this church. She died probably 5 years ago, something like that. Or more than that. I know, life, time. Oof. But she gave a witness to reconciliation many years ago. It was one of the earlier ones about reconciling with death. She had had a child die in his 20s and then Jim's death that I think was very impactful to all of us. Well, Jim had written this piece about secondary suffering from when his son had cancer and died. And they had this beautiful book put together that took her witness to reconciliation and Jim's piece. And I'm going to bring those out and put them on the Welcome Center desk. We have about 12 of them left. And maybe we'll keep one back that we could make copies of. But it's a beautiful description, I think, from some of the saints of this church about what it is like when we walk alongside people who are suffering and the impacts that it has on us. Because, all the helpers in the room know this, but it's true for all of us when we sit and talk with someone in the gathering area, or someone catches us on the way out and you're there 30 minutes later, listening to someone talk about what they're dealing with. We all get impacted by the suffering of other people that we hear about. And I think those two pieces would be a lovely way for some of us to be reminded of the fact that folk have been talking about this here for a long time. I'm real aware of the pace at which I was going, and I realized this is this much of what I wanted to share. So, but what I promise for next time, and we still have plenty of time to talk here, but is some practical tools. So please do come back for that.
Say your name first.
My name is Emily. Thank you, Jill. This was amazing. I'm wondering a bit about the window of tolerance. First of all, about that descriptor tolerance. It seems very
Yeah.
disengaged and dispassionate, and I don't know. It's a fascinating word to me. It's not thriving, right? It's not
Right.
engaging and doing well in life. It's, well, I can tolerate it. So that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
But also when we talk about expanding that or increasing the limits of that in someone's life, how do you describe that, or how can we go about that? I know part of that's this practice piece, but is it that you're going to be spending more time in that zone, or that zone then encapsulates more areas of your life? Like, how would you describe that
That's really
movement?
Well, I wouldn't disagree at all with your description of not loving that word tolerance, right? It's not a great word. It's just the word of the people who taught it to me, so there it is. But I would describe it as, I like the word of shalom, really, myself, that's the place where we can be our best selves, that's the place where we can relate well, where we can enjoy life, where we can tolerate the bumps in the road without getting completely spun off the road. Those are some of the ways I would describe that. But that's a great question about when we talk about wanting to make that a wider band. I'm thinking particularly for people for whom it's really narrow. And there are people who've lived so much of their lives in one or the other, above and below, that the window is pretty narrow. So the work that they have to do, the work that I had to do when I'll be honest, what happened, I think, by the time all that stuff went down and we were toward the summer of 2020, my window of tolerance had gotten pretty small. And it was mostly my colleague who could testify to that, how frequently I'd be up above it, or crashing down below it or whatever. So y'all can give some empathy to Gordon about all that. Then it was about using a variety of tools. It's not just a meditation. I mean, the tools at our disposal are pretty wide. I didn't talk at all about the ways that we learn how to regulate our emotional systems. And it starts as co-regulation, right, with parents. If in an ideal world where you get to be parented by the person who gave birth to you and there's a strong attachment there, I know that was a whole lot of ifs, but if those things are all in place, children, babies learn to deal with their nervous system by essentially co-regulating with their mothers, and their fathers. The reason they now know to put babies on skin, right, of their parents, and you'll see men as well as women who do this now, put their little infants on their skin. That's about co-regulation that they're learning. But we as adults, if you never learned how to regulate for yourself, we can co-regulate too. And two of the chief ways we co-regulate as adults, because there's not a lot of people who are going to let us be on their skin, right, like that, unless you have a spouse who will do that for you, is being in nature. Fascinating that one of the quickest ways that many of us can get our emotional systems regulated is being in the natural world. And the other is pets. Fascinating, right? Therapists provide that safe space. There's a lot of co-regulation that goes on when you're in the space with a therapist who is trusted. You can have friendships that provide that environment. We now have learned the language in our family to say, I need to co-regulate. And so it means come snuggle with me. It means let's get on the couch and put a blanket on, that kind of thing. So there's ways we can do it with other people as well. So learning all of the different ways that you can get your system to be more regulated helps that window get larger. And then learning what are my tools that work for me, which are going to be different than the ones that work for someone else, when I'm up or down, and how to come back into it. So the practices matter, but there's a lot more too that goes into it.
Lance Engbers, we haven't been here real long, but I presume you've got a job description.
Yeah. I'm laughing,
And there's
sorry.
limited hours in a day.
Yeah, sure.
And what you're presenting, I guess I'm curious, because it's a body of information that has a kind of a therapeutic nature to it.
Sure.
That could lead to a half-time or
Yeah.
full-time position for that
Sure.
matter. So I'm curious
Yeah.
how you see the future unfolding after a sabbatical like that. Does it just, you integrate that into what you're already doing? Or is it something that's going to expand
Yeah.
your time and...
No, I mean, you are so spot on, in the sense of my interest in this, as you can see, go back a long way as well in my own work. And in my ministry before coming to Hope Church, there was a component of a vocational piece. I was 3/4 in churches, 1/4 in my rebirthing practice, and clearly any of this would have been brought into that work. I don't do that here. I was very clear when I came here, both starting a family and to a larger church than I had never ever served before. I'd always been a solo pastor in smaller places. There wasn't going to be no 3/4 time, right? There wasn't going to be space for it. I don't have a practice anymore. I don't do that. And I don't think I have a larger part of my portfolio in pastoral care than Gordon does. We both do it. It's what I bring with me into that work with people. So it gets used in pastoral, and I know the difference between pastoral care and therapy. I am not a therapist. If somebody is coming to me and we're doing work that's starting to go down that road, we make referrals, and we make them pretty quickly. And then as they continue to do their work in a therapeutic environment, and I know the kind of people I'm looking for, I scan through their things to see what they're specialized in, and if I don't see keywords, they're not on my list. So it's about finding the right kind of therapist that I know can do this kind of work if that's what's needed. Then they're touching back with us, checking in, talking about maybe some more explicit parts of how their faith life is connecting with the therapeutic work they're doing. So it is not something that I expect to have become a bigger part of my job description, if you will. But I utilize it like restorative circle work. You don't know how much restorative circle training has impacted how I inhabit personnel supervision of staff, consistory meetings when tensions rise, a congregational meeting when there's some heat in the room. Like all of these things get utilized in the course of my work as a leader of this church, differently than I would have known how to do 15 years ago, 20 years ago, before I learned this. So it has an impact, but it's not in a direct way in terms of a practice or something.
Thanks.
Just a question, David Blau, just a question about the role of personality type
Yeah.
in the sweet spot of shalom.
Sure.
I'd like to have your feelings. I mean, you're
Yeah.
kind of bespeak to me of sort of the intuitive feeling type, which many of us
Yeah.
sort of here are.
Yeah.
But we have vitriolic personality
Yeah.
types and melancholic personality
sure.
types. So how do we, in your view, aim to widening the sweet spot, given the variables of personality type, and what does genetics have to do with this?
I'm not a scientist, so I will not be able to tell you in a precise way about that. But I think genetics clearly has a piece. One of the books that I read that doesn't sound like it's on the topic is one, Understanding Enneagram, which really speaks to the different kinds of ways that people have personalities or what motivates them. And part of my wanting to understand that better is because not everyone is an Enneagram 2 or an INF, I'm an IENFJ, if any of those things mean to you. These are personality things. Because there's no question, there was a moment in our staff, this goes back quite a number of years ago, that we were having some points of disconnection and some stress. And we recognized that getting some support to understand how we all think, feel, and are motivated was important. And so we had someone come do Enneagram work with us. And then Ann did a workshop with our staff once we got our reports. And we got to talk about, how somebody who's a Enneagram 5, who'd be a thinker and a sensor, these are not people who talk in terms of feelings much. I think I'm married to a 5. You find a feeling in there, It's just a really different way of moving through the world, and it's important to understand that. And everyone, no matter genetics or personality, have to find their way to do this work. So you are spot on. I don't know if that was helpful to say, except to say yes. Yeah. Go ahead, David.
So, yeah, Dave Myers, just a question of clarification about what you and the people that you're reading who are talking about trauma understand trauma to be as distinct from life stress.
Yeah.
Trauma historically used to be applied to battlefield survivors, rape victims, survivors of a horrific natural catastrophes.
Right.
And I think about my own life. I'm coping right now with a son who's disabled by depression and has twice attempted suicide.
Yes.
That's a life stress. That's suffering, but I don't call that a trauma. I don't think I've had any trauma in my life, or have I?
Right.
What's a stress and what's a trauma?
So I'm sure there's lots of different definitions out there. The people who were teaching me, Peter Levine, I think is one of the people that a lot of clinicians learned some of this work from. Deb Dana would say, I think in a similar way, that it's not so much the severity of what happened, which is what you're describing. Trauma's, had to be up in this certain kind of category of trauma to count, if you will. But it has more to do with if it has moved you into dysregulation and if that's become enduring. That's kind of the more clinical working definition of trauma. So somebody could go through, a war and get the support they need as they go through it and come out of it, such that they are not dealing with that as a trauma that follows them through their whole life. Someone could have a much different experience, suicide attempt, or just a variety of things that could go on that wouldn't be considered trauma from the outside, but it caused a dysregulation in them that moved into place and stayed in place over time, that it was starting to drive their life. They were always up in that elevated state, or always down in that dorsal state, or going between them with very little regulation, that would be considered trauma. It has more to do with kind of what it does to your functioning, more so than the severity of the thing that happened. I think that's my understanding of what they were saying. Some other therapists in the room could say better than I.
Carol Arzma, I was a peer support for the state of Michigan, trauma. I can't even think of it, TISM. Anyway, one of the things we stress to people is that your reactions are normal. You're reacting to an abnormal situation.
Yeah.
Being able to sort out our own feelings from what happened, and then go from there. You're right. I think almost any situation could feel like something like you're talking about someone you love dearly who's had made 2 suicide attempts. I do think it would definitely affect you, because that's not a normal situation. We don't expect that. Anyway, I learned a lot because I went through my own trauma when my sister was murdered in '69, and when I went on board, I worked for the state of Michigan in the Department of Corrections as a chaplain. So this was a perfect thing that I applied to get into that part of that team that would go to different prisons, and also other state workers that had gone through trauma and become a peer support. And so I really appreciated the training, and you no doubt did too, Jill, because then you realized that what you felt was, well, a normal reaction.
Yeah.
And that's very comforting, I think.
Yeah. definitely humanizing. I'm going to have Jane come forward as you talk to each other, because I really have to go get ready. And you'll probably all have to close quite soon, so.
Is there a?
Microphone, let me give you a microphone. I'm just looking at the clock and going, oh boy.
Yeah, I know you took too long. Thanks, Jill.
Grab my water, sorry.
So Jill just put herself outside the zone of tolerance because she stayed here for 10 more minutes than she should have. And we'll see her calm and easy when she gets out in front of us in the church. Are there a couple of other comments people would like to make before we close?
Just thinking back to the very first slide, Ann McKnight. The very first slide Jill had about just that Celtic shalom of God, self, nature, and others. And I think that the Appalachian Trail trip that we used to do with middle schoolers could not get ever enough credit and appreciation for bringing all of those things together during a really formative time in kids' lives, and that experience of being able to deal with an incredibly hard and challenging situation in the presence of supportive people and being able to be pushed past your window of tolerance often. I'm glad to be, that was actually the reason that Jim and I came to Hope Church in the first place, before we even had kids, because we thought, what kind of crazy people see taking middle schoolers on the Appalachian Trail as an important part of church life? I just think that's a really cool piece of what Hope Church has brought into the world. So.
And were you one of the people who went along? Larry Mulder, for years, also carried his backpack and told these younger people who were like 50 years younger than he was, you can do this, to get them out on the trail. And did your son do it as well? Did he do that?
Both kids did. I did 5. Yeah, both of our kids, I was kind of quietly praying all those years that Larry wouldn't quit doing it before both of our kids made it through. And so they both did. And Jim went on 1 year, and I did 5 years. So It was great.
Is there anyone else in the room who did that hike with the kids? Okay, there we go. I think we need a round of applause for these people. And the key is having people who are willing to do that along with the kids. That's essential. One more comment? Anybody would like to make?
Peter Bogart. I don't know that I have a question, but I have something I'm trying to deal with, having heard this material. And I'm wondering about the distinction between tolerance and endurance. So it seems to me it doesn't matter how well balanced I am, you can be in situations where it's time to leave. I don't have to endure an abusive boss. It's time to go. And I'm not quite sure how to draw a line like that. But it seems to me I don't want to err on the side of saying, oh, just stick it out, work on your skills.
I'm seeing people who work in therapeutic situations nodding out there. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's really important.
Well, it is time to leave at this point. Be sure to come back next week and hear more from Jill, and maybe get that question redirected again, maybe to Jill.
So
see you
let's
next
just
week.
close in prayer. Creative Holy Spirit, who holds all of creation, who connects us with creation and with one another. Thank you for Jill. Thank you for the people she's worked with that have brought her to this place, and for what she brings to this church. Thank you for the people in this room who have connected deeply with the things said today, who themselves have experienced life stresses, who themselves have befriended people who are walking a difficult road. Bring your shalom to us as we leave this place, and bring your shalom to us every time we're in it. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
See you next week.